have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, who will be Jorke Grotenhuis, who is going to speak on hieroglyphic sign lists. I'm particularly pleased to introduce Jorke Grotenhuis because he received his PhD in Languages, Literatures, and Translation Studies from the University of Liège under the supervision of Professor Jean Monin. However, he received his bachelor's and his MA at Leiden University, and he actually started his BA there while I was still in Leiden teaching in the Papyrological Institute. He received his bachelor's degree in Egyptian language and culture in 2013, I believe, and his master's in classics and ancient civilizations in 2014. He then went on to complete his PhD in 2019 and is now finishing up a postdoc at the University of California, Berkeley in the linguistics department under the supervision of Dr. Deborah Anderson. And that's where he's working on the upcoming hieroglyphic repertoire extension for the Unicode Repertoire extension. In addition to his work on hieroglyphic sign lists and Unicode and their digital implementation, he also has an interest in language variation in texts. And in fact, he did his PhD on language variation in the coffin texts, and how this variation, what this variation tells us about linguistics variation in ancient Egypt. And he's also interested in digital humanities and how this can be used to explore ancient Egyptian culture. Shortly after this lecture, in a couple of weeks, he will be starting on another postdoc at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem under the supervision of Professor Orly Goldwasser as part of the I classifier project in the Archaeo Mind Lab. The project creates network mappings of the mind of ancient cultures such as Egypt, Sumer, ancient Chinese, according to the classifier systems of their scripts. So I would like you all to welcome Dr. Jorke Grotenhuis now to provide the lecture for today.
Right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you for people that are watching this online. And I want to extend my thank you as well to Foy and Matthew for helping to organize this lecture. And I'm very grateful that they allowed me to talk here. And you can decide after the lecture if it was actually worthwhile. So, today I will be talking about hieroglyphic sign lists in general a bit, but that one is going to be really short because I have a lot to talk about and not that much time to do it in. And beyond that, the Thot Sign List has been launched in 2019, and the Unicode Expansion of the hieroglyphic set that's currently already in the system, and more of that later. So, yeah, these are the subjects. So for the history of sign lists, as ever, as we're all rather bound to in Egyptology, we have to arc back to Champollion, where he is one of the people that, besides taking part of the credit of deciphering hieroglyphs, long story about deciphering hieroglyphs that there's a lot of discussion about it, who should get the credit. I don't have the time to go into that one, and I don't want to mix myself too much into that lecture at all, if possible, but at least he, besides his work on the decipherment, he also produced the sign lists, where he basically gave already statements about these signs exist, these are the general functions of the signs, so how are they used, and those kind of features. So there are some familiar sequences here, and here he already put them in certain categories that would sound familiar to the more modern Egyptologists as well. Well, then later, during the late 18th century, there was a Teinhard font which was developed besides the IVO font, of which I will talk of later. And this font was specifically developed for publications in Egyptology because, well, you can't put any hand drawings all the time into your publications, even back then. So this is the lead typeset material from the Teinhard fonts. What is really important as a development for sign list here is that you get here the rather strict focus towards the case where you have real categories as man, female, divinity, and animal, and so forth. So the start to make it into categories just to make sure that people can actually grasp with how many signs there are and how you can look through them starts to develop here. Of course, this leads eventually into the close to best known sign list around, Gardner. One of the major important features that Gardner added in this list here is actually the feature that it's not only just a sign list of a set of shapes, it's also a commented sign list. So therefore it has descriptions of what the signs actually are, in most cases, not all. And it also has multiple functions of the sign. So therefore it has a functional, a descriptive, and an image sign list. However, he is still very limited to the material. So he, as he states himself as well, his materials very limited to his discussion of his grammar. So how many signs he has in his list, with 600 something, they are limited to mostly the material he uses for his grammar. So what was necessary to make his grammar work and to make sure that he could publish in it, and that everything that he wanted to discuss in his grammar, including assignments, were covered by the sign list. However, this is not remotely close to how many signs there theoretically are in ancient Egyptian world. And of course, what's very strict, of course, here is that we are still using it, is A to AA structuring of the categories that have gotten some slight adjustments but have stayed in place in Egyptology ever since. Around the same time that Gardner created his sign list, there was also the development from Ehrman and Graaphoff from the Wörterbuch that decided to work on their own sign list as in connection to their material in the Wörterbuch. This one was in development during the 1930s, and well, let's say something happened during the 1930s and 40s, which delayed its publication to the extent that it was never released. However, as I listed the site here, currently it is online, their material. It's interesting to take a look through, but you do need the Wörterbuch next to it as well to be able to locate where the hell the signs actually come from. So, as stated before, the IVO font was developed as well. Same reasoning as the Tynard font, primarily for publications, and in this case specifically the publications for the Ptolemaic temples. These Ptolemaic temples are dealing with the late periods of the hieroglyphic language, or script better to say. So we're dealing with about at least 6,000 to 7,000 signs that are often of use to worthwhile for inclusion in letter typesets. So this was originally developed by the IVO. The original set was really simply just a list of shapes, no commentation of where they came from, no comments whatsoever. But with the later updates under Saneron, some details were added, but even that is still currently rather lacking if you really want to find where certain signs come from. Well, of course, there have been many sign lists since then. So they often occur in very specific contexts. So you have cases that sign lists are attached to grammars. They are part of dictionaries, so Hanning van der Molen. They are specifically sign lists related to paleographical works. In this case, the paleograph Hieroglyphic from Meeks and his colleagues stand out, but there is also the Hibbs Temple Project and any other paleography work you can talk about. Really, I have difficulty pronouncing it today. Then you have also the addendum to series, so that's Damas and Calville for Dendera, and Sanderon for the Esna books themselves, for specific shapes and functions there. Then you have the cryptographic hieroglyphs, so that's Verman, Drieton in the early 1900s, and Danel and Robertson more recently, for specific functions of signs that are usually not attested in normal text, but only in cryptography or in enigmatic hieroglyphic use. Then there's the unpublished list from Horner and Schenkel. This one was partly just based on their own research, but this one is unpublished. Thanks to the work I've done, I've luckily have gotten some access to it. It's a very good sign list, actually. The shapes are very close to the signs that they are supposed to depict, but they're still, of course, limited by the material they had. So, for example, an issue with the Horner and Schenkel sign list that quite a few signs refer to the coffin texts, where they copied the box transcription rather than actually the original form. And if somebody ever has actually looked at the coffin text, will know that most of the signs are cursive to near hieratic, and therefore are not really a good source for true hieroglyphic forms. But also more recently and ancient, I made this one way too short, but you also have started more hieratic sign list. So of course Muller with this list, but also more recently the Akku project in Mainz, which have been working on a digitized sign list, which is very promising and it's already rather nice looking. So, one of the main reasons I'm talking here today as well is because I'm working towards the whole idea of digitization of hieroglyphic transcriptions. This started in 1988 with the Manual de Codage, for short. The whole title is on there, where they basically started to collect all kinds of shapes together because they noticed that the shapes of signs are not stable around every different font that exists. So IVO looks different than Tynard. Tynard looks different than Gardner. Gardner looks different than Horning Schenkel, and so forth. And they started to group these forms together when we're rather certain that they are depicting the same sign. So, for example, the A1, the first one is Gardner, the second, third, and fourth is Horning and Schenkel. Then you have the fifth is, if I'm not mistaken, is IVO, and I'm not 100% sure about the last anymore. But here you see the problem that you have multiple signs that look slightly different, and you really march into the territory. Where does the line lie? When do you talk about the same sign? When do you talk about a different sign? And this border is a lot fuzzier than you would like. So, this original list for 1988 was updated in 2000 using the Hieroglyphica font set, so that's the font used by the program Glyph. And this was updated to about 7,000 signs. This group, however, this extended library was not annotated whatsoever. So there was no case taken for, okay, where does it come from? What does it mean? What is it actually? And this has been the start of quite a few problems, actually. And especially when you start to study sign lists and signs on themselves, you start to figure out that you can't, for the life of you, relocate where they actually got the material from, which is rather an issue. But to come back quickly, so these have been a few of the main sign lists, or at least programs that used for hieroglyphic transcriptions. So going from Glyph to Maxrive, WinGlyph, JSH, Perfect Glyph, Visual Glyph is the most recent program out of this one. But they're all based upon either the Hieroglyphica font or the ASH font. And you will see that there are differences between them, and that does become problematic over time. Like I said, I have to be short here. So if you want a more in-depth detail about sign lists and their development, this is one of the articles you could look for from Ingelo Haveman. Or, depending on how good your French is, you can look up the Guide d'Écriture edited by Stéphane Police, which should soonish come out as an English version as well. I'm not exactly sure about the time frame here, but that one is also, because it's the year of Champollion and decipherment, this is one of those books that came out that discusses all aspects of science in ancient Egypt in a very short format. So most articles are 2 pages at most, lots of images. It's a really easy and nice access to get into. So, to come back to the points basically that I made here is that sign lists occur in different formats because they have different specific uses to people. And rarely do they all overlap in one location. So generally, for publication and everything, what you need is a font list, because you just need to be able to represent the shapes you see on the wall on paper. However, this is purely only usable for reproduction of material. It doesn't tell you anything or how to use it. So for more on the level of students and Egyptologists themselves, you want to have the commented sign list, so one that describes what a sign actually is and how it functions in the text. Another rather important feature here, especially when you're actually researching sign lists, is if they are referenced or not. Because quite often they are not, and then you start to figure out that basically it's conjecture. But this is conjecture that sneaks into Egyptology, and that can be built upon, and that the whole idea that this is built on basically nothing gets lost over time. To give you an example that goes back to Gardner, Gardner has a glyph under his bird, whereas there's an owl with an arm over it with a cake in its hand. This does not, to my knowledge, occur as a hieroglyph, because this is based on hieratic, because Gardner had a strong interest in hieratic. But in hieratic, it will only be represented as an arm with a little quick tick on it. But you can describe that as the man holding as the arm holding a stick as well. And this is where convention comes in. So does the sign exist or not? I can't say with certainty because, hey, tomorrow there might be they might find something where the sign does occur. So I don't want to say absolutely it doesn't exist, but it does show that certain things become accepted as tradition, but might need a little extra view. And finally, here on this one as well, is the paleographical information. You will see today that I will mostly move towards the functional aspect of sign lists, and that means how they are used. I don't want to state that paleography is not important. No, it is really important. But you always have to remember, why do you use something? But paleography, it is really useful to find every variant of every sign ever existing. But if you want to make a practical list out of that and to make sure that every little tiny variation is represented, you will end up with about 500 or to 1,000 of only the seated man. I'm not sure if anybody who wants to actually simply put a text on paper really wants to seek through those 1,000 signs to make sure that they can actually find it. So there is the balance where you have to work with. Paleography is horrendously important, and it tells you a lot about many aspects of Egyptology, but you always have to choose where you focus on it. It's nearly impossible to make a perfect sign list for 3,000 years of history of signs that are practically handwritten, even if they're carved in a wall. None of them will be identical. None of them will be a typeset, so it will never be completely stable. So you have to make choices in how you attach things. So, how did mostly I do my research in hieroglyphs? This is actually one of the approaches. There will be thousands of different approaches, but basically I simply went from an existing reference sign list and simply searched back through the sources and just checked it with the images of the objects and see if the signs line up close enough. But as you can see, here's a rather expensive list that we have used, and this gives remarkably decent results. But it does create also some issues, because, for example, if you take Voleurs Fanatiques, which is based on the IVO font, there they describe the sources where you can find them. But this is not for where you can find them, this is where their function is described. So what you have in certain cases is that Voleurs Fanatiques, made by Damas, refers to his publication of Mamises because there he discusses the function of the sign, which is also published by Damas, where afterwards you have to actually check the publication of the Mamisi itself before you actually get to an actual image, also published by Damas. There were moments where I really wished that they cut out the middleman and just sent me directly to the actual location of where the sign occurs. But because the focus of Voleurs de Fanatiques is to provide an explanation for the function, it will go to the article that describes the function rather than the shape. But it does create frustration if you actually want to find the image. Besides the material that we have been using the databases to which we have access. So the TLA, the Ramses Online, and Project Karnak, which have a rather extensive encoding of digital transcription done. And because this is digital, the codes of all the encodings are kept. So you can basically, if you have a code, you can search through it. So therefore, you have a lot more easier time to find material. And especially with Project Karnak, they have magnificent images as well. So it makes it a lot easier to see if something is actually correct. And of course, you have the publications that have been done recently. So in the case of Halof, for Sylvie Scoville's work with Dendra, then Eike Lebrique for Comombo, and Leitzen Teotina for Antribes, which have kept their encodings for the publications. They have kept them, and they were very gracious to lend it to us. So that allows us to search through other documents to find locations where those signs occur as well, which is also makes your life a lot easier. I can't say that I don't stand on the shoulders of giants here. But here I want to already bring something up that we implemented in the Thot Sign List, where we basically made a certain distinction between what things are. So at the first level, we have a token. This is a single image of an hieroglyph. It can be any image. So it can be an ancient one, it can be a modern one, as you can see here. So I have the Yesesh one, the one from an actual source, and the one from Horny and Schenkel. All these three are tokens by themselves. So they are simply a single image of them, but we don't refer to them yet, in this case, as a sign, because that has a tendency to discover what it is. On top of that, we have the idea of a class. So this is a group of tokens that share similar features and similar functions, and therefore can be grouped together. So I pulled here up W11 and W12 from Gardner. These two signs should not be considered the same sign in this regard. They are classes. However, they will belong together as the theoretical construct which we can call a sign, or in our case, what we call a grapheme, which is a cluster of classes that have similar iconographical features and has the same functions, but are not identical. But there is a clear sight that they belong together to some extent. So these are cases how you can deal with chronology. So, for example, the example I showed here earlier is that the first one is the more common form from Middle Kingdom onwards, and the second one is more used in the Old Kingdom. And this is a chronological development already marked by Gardner himself as well. But functionally, they function the same, and they can easily overlap. So if I would put the second sign into a Ptolemaic text, you don't have to think of what you're looking at. This is basically the whole idea of how would you look at an A in Calibri and an A in Times New Roman. They don't look exactly the same, but you instinctively understand that they are the same thing. How instinctively this is rather up for discussion, but this gives you a bit idea. But to give you another case here, these four signs, they are functionally the same to some extent. Of course, they have specific functions by their own, but they all have the function of phonogram sa. But they will never be classes that belong to the same sign, because they are clearly distinct different entities. One is a duck/goose, one is an egg, one is some type of float, and the other one is the cover of a quiver. There's no reason why you would put these ones together. So there are limits to how far you can extend on a graphical level before you really have to call something its own entity. Well, this is where we start to hit towards trouble. So one of the small details that is sometimes not really that well attested is that we have the same numbers for certain signs, but they are not actually the same sign. So in this case, we have R15, which is based in the Yesesh and Gardner form, and the Hieroglyphica form. And I hope it's obvious that they are not exactly the same. However, to make our life as much of an issue as possible, both forms do actually exist in the structure. So basically, I cannot say that, okay, Gardner is the superior font than Hieroglyphica. No, they both exist. But because Hieroglyphica did not give good notes of what they base their images on, you lose this type of information. Functionally, these two signs are identical. They are just classes of each other. But especially when you're dealing with databases, if you not know beforehand if the database uses Hieroglyphica or Yesesh, changes will happen in the transcription that will move it further away from the original. And this is the whole point. Do you want that or not? And that is part of the work that we're trying to do here with the Thot Sign List, but also with Unicode, is trying to make sure that does not happen too much. So, another issue that popped up while discussing this, brought up by Daniel Werning, is what we have been starting to call the beard issue. So there are basically beards on signs in the hieroglyphic script, and often enough the hieroglyphs are small enough that it's really difficult to make a distinction. However, we were able to generalize into 4 groups. So you have the short and straight for nobility, the long and straight for royalty, long and curved for divinities, and bushy for foreigners. Now, as you can see here, there's no way to distinguish between bushy and short and straight. This is a feature in Hieroglyphica where every beard is basically the same form. But considering that you're dealing with a font that is rather small, I'm not surprised that they did not make the change. This is one of the features that we have been fixing. However, there are additional issues that shows up with this. So we have cases of the seated king or god with the red crown. Both of them used as classifier for Biti, for the king of Lower Egypt. However, I hope you can see here that the beards are not identical. One is curved forward, one is straight. Functionally, on a bare bones page, they are still the same sign. However, there is a semantic difference that is really hard to describe, because the one with the curved beard is the king in the context of divinity. So the king here is divine. In the other context, it's a more mundane inscription, and the king is simply the king. So the Egyptians did take effort, especially when you're dealing with high monuments, that they made some distinction, and you cannot rule out the difference between these two. So if you make a sign list, do you put both in? Do you standardize it to one? But if you standardize to one, which one? These are questions that come up all the time. And by the way, I don't have good answers for any of these questions, to be honest, because I usually can argue both sides rather easily. Another issue that sneaked in with Hieroglyphica. I hope it's rather obvious what the difference is here, because, yes, one has breast, the other one doesn't. This is a feature from Hieroglyphica that's in there, and based on most of our work that we have done, the Ye-Session Gardner font is better here. So for most of the pharaonic periods, this is true, that there are no breasts visible on any carvings of a hieroglyph of a female, or at least when they are seated in this form. When they're standing, it's a different story. However, there are also slight complexities to this one. Say, if you have a 40, the seated god, which is not written that nicely with a beard, how do you distinguish in this case between male and female? Now here, because it's Osiris, you know we're dealing with a male here. But this specific stele, there is no way to distinguish between male and female in the hieroglyphs. And at that point, you need to put the burden is on the Egyptologist when explaining this, that there's a difference. However, of course, when we're dealing with the later Ptolemaic period, breasts do actually show up in these figures. I have had quite difficulty finding many examples, but it is possible. The only counter I could give here is that these are actually not breasts, but they're simply an effect of their wigs. But I'm not even convinced of that one myself that much. But it is the case, once again here, that we're dealing with a case that both versions exist. Main issue for me here, actually, is that if I want to go with more applicable, I prefer the Ye-Sesh option. However, I do see value in actually using the Hieroglyphica version as the primary form from female here. Not because it's paleographically correct, but when you make a transcription, you instantly transmit to people, I'm not discussing, this is female. And therefore, you kind of upgrade an ancient source a bit to make it easier to digest. But is that correct? I can't say. Same issue occurs with chronological variants, where, for example, the M4, as mostly depicted, has a round adhesion. However, especially in the Ptolemaic period, this is mostly replaced by a triangular shape on there. This is actually a rather good chronological distinction. So often, if you see this sharp edge on the M4, you will know with near certainty that you're dealing with a later period text here. However, with the earlier ones, you can't really say. And by the way, these are not the only variant options. There are more than this, besides the general variations of the sign to begin with. So this is a rather broad section. But once again, you're dealing with a case. When you present a sign list, do you really want to include all of them? Do you only want to include one of them? How do you treat this material? Once again, I have no distinct answer. And of course, to be a few cases, of course, Egypt is not Egypt when the carvers don't have a bit of fun with their texts. So, for example, here we're dealing with the Whitechapel, where the sign that would normally be transcribed as O21, a shrine, is actually depicting the Whitechapel itself. Because this is the playfulness of the language that the Egyptians dealt with, because the carvers could take the time to actually work this out. This happens a lot, that signs match up with the iconography or the building they are attached to. But if you want to make a standardized hieroglyphic list, is it valuable to add this or not? I would, in this case, argue towards not, as long as you make sure you mention that these types of things happen. But because this will only occur in this text. This only occurs in the Whitechapel. This only occurs 2 times. If you want to make a standardized list for transcription, is it worthwhile to include? I would argue on the side of probably not, but I can completely understand why you want to include it. And of course, sometimes you have way too many variants. This is simply a quick take from the Thot Sign List of the Gerrit Nature group. This one extends way further. Basically, every instance of this sign is its own variant. There are more signs like this one in hieroglyphic script as well that are extremely varied, and at some point you really have to ask, is it worthwhile to force somebody to look through 40 different variants of the same sign if they want simply to put something on paper? Choices have to be made. Well, so now I'm going to jump a bit late, sorry for that. I'm going to jump towards the history of the Thot Sign Lists. And I have to say I am going to go way too fast over this because I'm already running out of time. So this project started in 2013 when there were some issues that really became noticeable by the digital encoding of hieroglyphs. So making hieroglyphs be used for, with digital tools. This is more difficult to expect, but they started ball going. So Stefan and Serge Rosmenduk have written some articles about this and started to build up. Then in 2015, with the second to last Egyptological conference, they actually proposed the project of the Thot Sign List, which I am talking about. Thanks to Joachim Kwak, who was at that point leader of the TLA project. Jean Winan received the Annelies Meyer Award, which funded the entire project, and indirectly myself as well. So this is a combination work between the Berlin Brandenburgische Akademie der Wissenschaften and the ULIH. So the first step was the creation of an online thesaurus, because you need to make sure that if you're dealing with databases, that your underlying terms and descriptions are the same. So therefore, the Thoth thesaurus has been developed, and this has been used in multiple digital projects since. So you have Clio, you have the Aku project, and quite a few more that have started to use this system to make sure that the data stays the same and in line, that you use the same descriptions for material. This was done on, under Vincent Raciziano. I always have difficulty with his last name. So then, with the help of Luc de Serre from the Center for Philosophy Letters, we developed an encoding database for the Thot Sign List. And this one, as a first upload, to have to be some data to start with. You have the data from the Berliner Zeigerliste, which was digitized in Berlin already and then imported into the database. We have Yesesh, which was imported into there. The Horning and Schenkel, which was imported into there. And then I was hired to actually work on a sign list and try to figure all the details out, make sure that all the fields are filled. I was not the only one doing this. We had multiple people from Berlin, multiple student assistants as well. Later there will be a link to the article about the sign list where you have the full list of current and former people that worked with us. But as main people of the project, we have Stefan Polies, Daniel Werning, Peter Dils, and Ingeloor Haverman for the time before she retired. And her function is currently taken over by Daniel Werning. These are currently basically the prime movers of the project, and also the people that make sure that everything stays correct. So, in 2019, in Cairo, we are able to launch the project. Currently, the sign list consists of what we call the Gardner Plus, so it includes the entire sign list of Gardner, plus whatever additions we found along the way. And that is published online on this article. It's freely available. And there you can find all more in detail that I have to skip over. So basically, we have been encoding the data here. The signs that we have imported, because we imported them, they are a lot higher than the ones that we worked on. But you can see that for functions and tokens, it's much more equal. So we're a lot less behind. Sorry that I can't go in detail here. So I would recommend to look this up. The sign list up online. And I would recommend using it, obviously. It's not like I have my own work bound in there. And of course, I would love if you have any remarks or comments about the sign list, please send them to us. We love to hear it because we want to have a good product, not simply because we worked on it, we expect it to be good. No, please correct us when we're wrong. So you can see that we put it up, so you can get the functions, then you have the sources, so they're always built as short phrases so that you can actually prove the functions, because this is very lacking due to space in published sign lists. Those sources are always bound as possible towards facsimiles or actual images, preferably actual images. Here you can see that we have a separate tab for the classes. We actually show the tokens here as well. You can see the quality of the image varies rather drastically because you have to deal with what you can get. And there's also a search function that you can basically search signs specifically, but you can also search for specific verbal forms or whatever, so that if you're not sure what sign could be in a lacunae, you can find it this way. So, basically, because originally it's based on the necessity for electronic corpora, the primary focus of the Thot Sign List is function over shape. So although we build up some paleographical framework over time, very slowly, this does not stay in place. So basically, we can only work from functions out because that's simply for practicality. It's not practical to try to collect all shapes in Egyptology before you start dealing with it. So the sign list is primarily functional, not paleographical. There are features in there that we already started marking where we found them, but it is a good thing to keep in mind that we really focus on function over anything else. And all the decisions are based in it. But as stated before, what we found it essential to feature is that it needs to be referenced to the ancient source. If we can't do that, so if we're stuck with the transcription, we don't use it. Basically, we go under the assumption that people make too many mistakes in those transcriptions, and unless you can go back to the original, you cannot trust it. It's a bit harsh to say it that way, but it's simply something that's necessary. Some functions in the Thot Sign currently are depicted by transcription, but that's because there are no sources except for that to refer to a Gardner function depicted in Gardner. And to include that, we had to, but not happily. And additional, we have the description of the iconic feature. So and by the way, the descriptions were done by me. So if you have issues with the description of the Thot Sign List, please say so. I gladly fix it. And it is we try to make a structured repertoire out of it, because the code points that are based on Gardner, especially when you have additional signs coming in, stop making sense, because they basically just counted onwards. And so there's no underlying structure in the whole structure. So for Gardner, there was still that you move from seated figures to standing figures. But with the code system for the additional signs, they were just added as 100, 142, or whatever, and the whole underlying structure of slowly building from type to type to type is lost. And we try to rebuild it a little bit, but it's not one of the most easy things to do when you need to accommodate Egyptologists that are used to certain things, because otherwise you want to restructure things completely. So, for what we do, basically we start from a token, we go to the source is linked to a document. This document and the source are bound to all kinds of metadata. This is where the thesaurus comes in. So you have where it comes from, the date, and everything is linked in there. Then the function is theoretically attached to the token, because the token itself has a function in the phrase, so therefore it has a function. And the token itself is automatically a class, but if we're going to use it for a prototypical sign or not, is something else. But it's automatically a class. In this case, there will be currently 3 classes that we understand for this rowing form. And these classes together form the sign. In reality, in encoding, the function is bound on the sign level, but on the theoretical level, it should not be understood like that. This is simply for on practical level, so that you don't have to encode the function for every different token you add, because that gets a bit tedious after 10,000. So there are indirect lines that are more on a theoretical level than actually realistic. And this is to give you a depiction. So you have the grapheme, i.e. sign, which encompasses all the tokens and therefore all the classes. But usually you choose one of the classes to be the representation of the sign. That does not mean that it is the best representation for that sign. There are cases where we started to figure out that the standard Gardner sign is actually the bad choice, that it's actually one of the subforms that is much more common and better to use, actually. So, in the recent developments then, we have quite a few. There's a new project that started with Philippe Serre, postdoctoral student in Liège, in science, who works on the documentation of signs not yet recorded in any sign list, because there are quite a few of those as well, to our utter surprise. And so, for example, you have material like this, but he is also focusing on local variants of signs. And this one is, for me, is still one, because if I look at this, my first instinct would be to put it in the drills rather than get them, which it is here. And this is specifically focusing on the first intermediate period and second intermediate periods, and the hieroglyphic sign shapes influenced by corresponding hieratic graphemes. That's the reason why this looks quite different. For more detail, I would recommend you to contact Philip. He will probably not mind to discuss the more, and he's also working on the sign bibliography. So with sign bibliography, we mean publications like Keimer, who discussed all kinds of zoological animals in the hieroglyphic script, and those type of sources that discuss shape, what is it, what is the function, all that type of literature, and we try to collect most of that together. But it's also something he's working on. Now, then for Unicode, it's going to be tight. So, quickly, what is Unicode? Unicode is a so-called code standard on a digital level that makes sure that depictions from one program doesn't change. So that means that an A will always stay an A. It doesn't mean that it doesn't suddenly become a B when you move it online, or that it becomes a C or anything else, or even when you make different font choices. So if you switch from one font to the other, it will still stay the letter A. This is basically the underlying code standard. So the idea of the letter A has a code, and all fonts simply refer to that code point is then depicted in that font. So that's where it comes from, and this is an underlying standard. This is horrendously important for digital interaction, but it's a bit difficult to grasp at times, and I have still difficulty explaining it correctly. But it's an underlying code system that is unapologetic, but it's really a necessity for digital tools. So the original proposal is in 1997 for a hieroglyphic set in Unicode. This took a while before it was actually accepted, and it became a set of 1,071 signs, primarily from Gardner, but there are some additional sources. And there are some signs in there that we're still figuring out, that we have been able to locate, but we're wondering why they were ever included. We don't know. This is sometimes the problem, that there's not a good literature being kept of why choices were made, and then it's sometimes really difficult to figure out. Additionally, it is not possible in this format to actually write out a line and actually arrange the hieroglyphs correctly. So it can only be done as a line. So the functionality for Egyptologists is rather limited, actually. So one of the steps that have been done is a proposal for the expansion of hieroglyphic repertoire. This is partly on request of other people as well, because we're dealing with Gardner, we're dealing with 18th dynasty hieroglyphs. But especially when you want to encode Ptolemaic text, you need a lot more. And this is where we moved into started the project that is for primarily for hieratic material, Ptolemaic material, so Greco-Roman texts, so all the variation of signs that come in there. So it's to blow it up. To give you a quick overview, this is our current team of people that we have semi-regular discussions about everything in related to sign lists, digital encodings and everything. This is it takes more time than you expect. The nearly 10-year, the 12-year mark for the first one gives you an idea that we have been working on this for a while, and we're doing it slightly quicker this time. But even then, one of the major features that have already been ended up in Unicode is the fact that we included control characters. Mind you, these inclusion and control tags will mean that within the font, it will be possible to simply write a text in Word, just convert your scripts, and because the control characters are covered by Microsoft, they will function. So you will be able to simply write a hieroglyphic text, so you don't have to pull an image out of a program anymore and paste it in your text. No, it's basically just like switching a font for a little while and switching back. So it's full embedding. But these control characters are necessary to do the basic functions we need to actually form hieroglyph transcription correctly. So we have a vertical joiner and a horizontal joiner. So one above another, one next to another. We have the corner insertions, so there are 4 of them. And in 2019 as well, we have an overlay as well. This is a very interesting feature as well, because especially when you're looking to the extended sign list, you will see that there are quite a few signs that exist simply by 2 signs spaced over each other. By including this control character, it's not necessary for sign list on a font level to include those signs anymore. So you can basically construct more signs than you actually have. And we have also segment start and segment end. These are features that, if you're familiar with encoding with JSH, is done by brackets. It's basically just to move things more closely together. And I have put the code here that's used to form this structure, but you can see that we can form quite a bit already with the system. This is already in Unicode. This is already theoretical functional, and I will show you later, well, soonish actually, that this works already to some extent in our beta version of the font. Then in 2022, additional 29 control characters were introduced in Unicode. They have been accepted, and since the 15th of September, they have been live. However, that does not mean that they can already be used. So it takes now time before Microsoft, Apple, and other software creators will implement the new Unicode standard into their work. But because this is part of the entire Unicode framework, if they work on one aspect of Unicode, they will import this section as well. So this will work in the near future. The additionals that we made here is middle insertion, so that you can actually put signs inside other signs. Top insertion and bottom insertion. Then we have enclosures, so that's primarily cartouches, but this also applies to hood signs, the battlement enclosures of foreign cities, and the like. And we have a rather broad system, so that you can basically cut them off if necessary as well, but still let them work so that you can transcribe correctly. A control that we can actually mirror signs, which was also not possible yet, and saves of space in a font as well, because now you only have to you have a control for the mirror, so it will be mirrored, and it does not take up space in a list, because you don't have to include both, looking both ways. Blanks, this is basically to move signs to positions where you want them partly. These are technically atomic characters, but it's better to keep them on the control character, because these are intended for encoding work. Then we have blank signs. So these are atomic characters as well, to denote something is lost here. We don't know what, but something was lost here. And we have damage modifiers. So you have to see that loss signs and damage modifiers are 2 distinct entities here. But this is really a necessity from the system, and we had long discussions of how to make this work, and this is what we currently got. It's still not perfect, but it's a lot better than we used to have, and you should not expect that with purely Unicode you can make perfect, paleographically correct transcriptions of text. This will never happen. But you will get very reasonable proximities. And then as well this year, there was also a so-called rotation variation selector. Variation selectors is basically when you select on your phone and you hold the E, you get all the different accents. That's a variation selector. So we decided to put rotations there because we don't have enough time to research every sign correctly to do that, to make the classes work in the same way. So therefore we could use it for rotations, and this solves other problems. I have to give it short on that one. And now for the repertoire itself. Basically, this is primarily based on Greco-Roman signs. This is funded through Deborah Anderson and UC Berkeley by Google Research Award. It's where I've been spending my last year on. And basically what we're doing here is that we create a candidate list of signs to suggest, okay, Unicode, these signs you can put into the list. We think that it's fine to put there. for whatever reason. This candidate list consists from modern and ancient sources together because we do want to be able for people to depict something existing in current publications, even though that might be wrong. We want to be able that people can actually transfer that data as well, even though I might hate the fact that certain cases are absolutely wrong and should not be used, but no, they are attested enough that it's worthwhile to include. But to deal with that whole issue of frustration of things that are existing, the candidate list is the entire list that goes into Unicode. We have, on top of that, based on the model used by Han Chinese, we have a so-called curated list, or what we call the core list. This core list is very important that we verified every single shape in there. We make sure that it has a description, we make sure that it has a function, that it's logically sound what we're doing here. All our other choices besides this will make sure that we have much more security, and we would strongly recommend font makers and Egyptologists as well to only use the core list if necessary. So only if you really want to refer to older material, you might use the full list, but I would always recommend only to use the core lists, and you should expect that fonts are probably only covered for the core list. That does not mean that you cannot use the code points for other signs, because they are in Unicode, so you can use them, but they will probably not be covered by any programs or fonts. So to give you an idea, that including the 1,000 signs that are existing, the Unicode candidate list is going to be about 4,000 to 4,500 signs. And if you consider that hieroglyphic and Yesesh are about 7,000, you might get an idea that I have filtered out quite a bit of what I would call junk, or at least stuff that I have no idea how to locate. And the file that I use always states cannot be found, should of course be read as could not find it, because you never say it doesn't exist, because most of these shapes were at some point made for a reason. It's not like one of the font makers just doodled something and put it in the list as well. No, they were probably made for a very specific case that were added, but nobody kept track, so there's no way to know. So therefore, the core list is a bit smaller, but all these signs that will go in the core list will have been validated with at least a facsimile or a photograph, and ideally a photograph, but sometimes. So, for example, with the epigraphic survey material, I trust the facsimile. With a lot of other material, I don't. So in those cases, I always try to find a picture. This is grueling work as well, but when this gets released in Unicode, the whole database file, Excel file we have, will be put online, will be accessible, warts and all, so don't be surprised if it's full of spelling mistakes, but it will all have the data, so you can verify the data, you can add a statement, hey guys, this does actually exist, I know where it is, or whatever, it will be available, because I want complete transparency in what we're doing, even though I might not have worded my choices always that well. So, now for the last little bit of promotion, by Andrew Grass of Microsoft and the University in Seattle, he has been making a Unicode hieroglyphic font, so that there's actually a font that works at least on the Microsoft level, so that the thing I said, that you can actually put this in Word without having to fiddle with images or anything. Here's the whole disclaimer of where the material comes from. I would invite you to read that. But based on what it currently is currently it's only based on the 1,701 signs currently in Unicode, so this is not yet based on the extended list, because that will take, sadly to say, years. Because we hope to have a finalized candidate list soon. We're not exactly there yet, but we're very close. So probably January we have a candidate list, then it still has to go through the entire process of Unicode. If Unicode's accepted, then it has to go to Microsoft and everything before it gets implemented there. And at that point, these say additional 3,000 signs do need to be drawn. And that's the thing that's going to take the most time, because you want to make sure that the font stays similar looking at least. And that is the main problem that we're going to have before we have the full extended list in it. But for these 1,701 signs, it works. The Unicode 12 control characters that I stated, so the bare bones arrangement material, is functional. The 15 control characters to be implemented in the future, and we expect early 2024, simply because we have to wait until it's implemented into the existing software material, which takes usually about a year. then we have to make sure that all the errors are out. But considering that we have been discussing this material, in our trial version, all the control characters work to some extent. Right, there's some error messages here and there, but they are already been at work. So basically, the second it is active in Windows, we can flip the switch and allow this out. And the current ideal, it's not 100% sure if it will happen or not, is that this font will be included with the Windows update. So you don't even have to do that much effort to get used to it. Yes, you have to get used to actually how you type, because it's slightly different. But it will already exist into the system itself, so you don't even have to, it basically gets freely delivered to you. That's the idea, but this is Windows only. That doesn't mean that I know how long it will take until it goes to iOS or any other system. I cannot say at all, because this is beyond my point. So the current 12 version is in beta. Basically, you can, if you're interested in playing around with it yourself, I can ask Andrew if he's willing to share it with you. I don't think he minds, because, say, more testers is more better. And yeah, like I said, the extended library is going to be 2025 at the earliest, most likely. This really depends on funding, how quickly it goes on all sides. We really can't say. So, now, what I quickly wanted to show you, for the few minutes left, is that it does actually work. So, I can just type these things out. There are multiple ways to do this. So you can type these things out. You can type 1, becomes a Z1 stroke. I can type Aleph, what was Aleph. There are multiple ways to type things here. It takes a little bit of effort to get used to the system, but it is very intuitive. And one of the nice features we have added as well is that, say, for example, you know which category your sign is in, but you're not really sure which number it is, and you don't want to look it up. Well, you can filter through these signs. So you can jump by category, and you automatically start at the first of the category, and you can go side to side and filter through that as well. So this will make typing it a little bit easier. So basically, we're working on the keyboard to make sure that it gets as easy as possible for people to use. Currently, it feels to me instinctive, but that might just be me. But if you're really used to, say, glyph or yesesh, yeah, it will take a little time to adapt. But the underlying principles are generally the same. So I would really like to thank you for your attention, and I hope I didn't bore you too much. And I also want to thank people online, if they are still there. And at least I hope you have a nice evening, morning, or whatever, depending on whenever you watch this.
For over 100 years, the OI has been a leading research center for the study of ancient Middle Eastern civilizations. Join us in uncovering the past and learn about the beginnings of our lives as humans together. Become a member by visiting oi.uchicago.edu/member.